Continuing on with Rene Guenon here, we are up to chapters 11, 12, and 13. 11 is unity and simplicity, 12 is the hatred of secrecy, and 13 is the postulates of rationalism. And here we have a series of chapters, I think, in which Rene Guenon is against a number of things, or at least he is representing a viewpoint on behalf of the esoteric worldview against modernity. Um, he's against these three things. He's against simplicity, and he's against popularization, and he's against rationalism in and for its own sake. He's against simplicity in the sense that he says that the sciences tend to try and reduce everything to the simplest possible units, atoms. Everything is composite, built up of these composite units. The whole world is built up out of the simple. And the assumption is made that nature always chooses the simplest path. Nature always goes the simplest way toward a goal. And he says this isn't true. Nature does not always do this. Nature is full of complexity, and he says, and he opposes, by inverse analogy, he opposes uniformity and simplicity against unity and the simple, the transcendent principle of unity, which is simple, but also complex at the same time. And it contains the same kind of complexity that a seed does, he says. A seed is at once a simple unit, but it's also very complex because it contains the entire future history of the organism inside of it, right there at the beginning. So there's a kind of hidden complexity there to that simplicity that he thinks the sciences miss when they take this approach of oversimplifying everything, democratizing it, bringing it down to the level of the masses, and distributing it for popular consumption. He's very much against the popularization of anything. And he objects to Protestantism. He was raised French Catholic, converted to Islam. But he says that Protestantism is an example of this process of oversimplification. He says it's the only religion that's been created during modernity, the period of modernization, which the line he draws at roughly the year 1500, in which all the rituals are simplified down to almost non-existence. All the doctrines are simplified down to very simple doctrines. And he says what you're left with there is just a kind of a shell, a husk, or a parody of religiosity. Religiosity, by its very nature, is complex. It isn't something simple. And this moves him into the chapter against popularization, where he talks about, he very much objects to this idea that everything has to be popularized in modernity, that there should be no secrets, is the idea. Anyone who's hoarding a secret, the secret needs to be taken away and democratized. So we have here what William Merwin Thompson called the democratization of the esoteric, in which in the New Age, and I think Guenon would have hated the New Age, I know that he attacked theosophy, which takes these old esoteric ideas of Taoism and alchemy and astrology, Kabbalah, and goddess worship and Wicca, and all this stuff that used to be esoteric is in the New Age democratized. It's brought out for popular mass consumption. But I think that even more, I think there's something more behind what Guenon is objecting to here. I don't think it's just the simple idea of popularizing esoteric secrets. I think once again, he's misunderstood the essence, the essentiality of Northwestern, what Spengler called Faustian civilization. It's a civilization that is based on shining light everywhere. It's a civilization that is based upon the conquest of everything, knowing everything, learning everything that can possibly be learned, and shining light into all the dark, hidden recesses of being, such that all entities are brought out into the clearing. And the clearing is simply Heidegger's term for the space of encounter between entities in an ontological system in a particular place and time where a being event has made new things possible that are brought out and made evident. The clearing is the clearing of evidentiary things. Entities are unconcealed, and we find out about them in the clearing. That's what the Faustian civilization has been about. Now, traditional civilizations, I think what's behind this is that, so Guenon wants to go back into the cave, what Spengler called the Levantine, or the Magian civilization, the cosmology of which presupposes the world as an enclosed dome, And in the ancient world, there were two types of enclosure. Both added up to a closed universe. The Greeks, with their world of enclosure, had a different kind of enclosure. They situated the earth at the center of the universe, the heaviest thing in existence, made up of the four elements and various modes of reciprocity, surrounded by these luminous crystalline spheres that were a quintessence, a fifth essence, that had the property of turning with perfect circular motion. So you had the moon going around the Earth, and then you had Mercury going around that, Venus, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn. Saturn was the outermost shell, other than the prima mobile, the prime mover on the outside that later becomes identified with the Empyrean, the realm of the fixed constellations and stars. And everything is enclosed inside of this. The Earth is very cozily enclosed in this, what Peter Sloterdijk would call a uteromorphic cosmology, very uterine, enclosed inside the body of a gigantic macrosphere, what Sloterdijk called macrospheres. But the Greeks, I think, would happily have blown that open. I mean, they were very much interested. They were probably the first to have this idea that there should not be any taboos on knowledge. Maybe the Pythagoreans were a different matter, esotericists of that time. But the Greeks in general, I think, were very much interested in opening up the clearing of knowledge as much as could possibly happen. And of course, Eratosthenes identified the circumference of the Earth almost exactly, came very close. They knew that it was round. They figured out that it was round. They were on the way to something. The Euclidean geometry, Archimedes with all of his wonderful inventions, they were on the way to something. But the civilization wound down and collapsed. And along comes a new civilization out of the process of what Toynbee calls the chrysalis of a dying civilization that gives birth to the new Magian civilization, the Judeo-Christian Byzantine Islamic civilization, which on the other hand now represents a regression of knowledge back to a dark age. Libraries are burnt at Alexandria. Christian mobs are on the loose, burning and looting all the old texts. They're against knowledge. They're against anything that has to do with knowing about the way the world really is, because we have these sacred texts now that tell us precisely what the cosmology is, and it's an enclosed dome with a flat earth. So they actually regress back to an older, outdated Mesopotamian cosmology of the earth as a flat disk surrounded by the spheres with a pit underneath it, the realm which becomes, in the Magian world, the pit becomes shale, the darkness underneath the world. So we have a new enclosure. The world is closed off, and knowledge now becomes something that is not to be known. It is to be confined only theologically to the world of the dome, the theological world in which the powers of light are struggling with the powers of darkness on the inside of this cosmic dome. And if you need confirmation for this dome as cosmology, you always go to a people's architecture, because a people's architecture best expresses their world feeling, how they feel about how the cosmos is. And of course, with the Arabs, it's always a mosque. It's always, the good stuff is always on this inside. The outer part is unadorned, whereas the Greeks had it opposite. They had all the adornments and aesthetic contrivances were all on the outside of the temple, and the inside was rather boring. With the, as Spengler says, with the Pantheon, you get the first mosque, basically. The Pantheon has an oculus, light shining directly down into it. It's dome-shaped. That's something new. This is the concept of the pseudomorphosis, where a new civilization is coming into being using the form language of the older civilization that lies so heavily over the land that it takes a while for it to get its sense of itself, thrusting through these old, outdated forms. You have Hagia Sophia, the great dome in the Byzantine civilization. So all this cosmology is bounded by the dome, and it absolutely forbids knowledge. There's a story in the Shahnameh, which is written by Ferdowsi, the great epic of the Persian kings, which is simply an old Sumerian king list that has accreted over time and become the actual structure of an epic that goes down through the genealogies of the kings. Ferdowsi lived in Persia about 1000 AD. And he wrote this epic, and there's a story in it about King Cavus, which is a story of the illustration of this dome, that there are limits to knowledge. Eblis, the devil in this tradition, sends a demon in the guise of a nice young man to go and talk to this King Cavus and to try and tempt him to go into a domain into the heavens where man does not belong. That's the domain of the gods, after all. So he builds this sort of contrivance, this throne. Poles are thrust through it, and eagles sit at the four ends of the poles, leaning forward to try and bite meat. And as they lean forward, they flap, and the throne lifts up into the air, and King Cavus sails up into the heavens, and the eagles gradually tire, and he drops and falls somewhere in China, and they have to go rescue him. But when they find him, they shame him, and they say, what sort of an idiot are you for desiring to go up to the world and knowing things that man simply is not meant to know? We're not meant to be up there. That's a civilization that's not going to the moon. Right? That's not going to happen with this civilization, with the Persians. They're not going to go to the moon because they have the enclosure. That's the world is enclosed. Man has his place there and cannot transcend beyond that. Whereas in the Northern European West, we have this idea of what Spengler calls Faustian civilization, and we get the Faust myth, in which the third temptation, Satan takes Christ up to the top of a mountain in the third temptation and tells him, the knowledge of all of this can be yours if you bow to me. And Christ says, no, thank you. But the Faustian West said, we'll take you up on that. Thank you. And so we did. And so in the West, knowledge, it was a long, slow, hard go, because knowledge, even in the West through the Middle Ages, was still regarded as of the devil. And so from out of all of this, Roger Bacon, the scholastic monk he was like a Leonardo, who was interested in the properties of magnetism and light, playing around with compasses. All of these guys, these Gothic monks, were the first to start toying around with gadgets. They built mechanical clocks, as Lewis Mumford chronicles in his wonderful Technics and Civilization. And so they're playing around with all this stuff. So you get the Faust myth that comes out of this, in which, and it's basically Germanic, the wager is taken for Faust to have experience. He's willing to go and have experience if he signs his soul away to the devil. And after he finds out all the things that he wants to know, like in Marlowe's play, he's damned and his soul is dragged off to hell. So that's the original idea, but that's a kind of pseudomorphosis on the West, actually, because it's alien to its actual interior telos, which is to know everything. Everything that can be learned, we want to learn it. We want to know it. And so you get the later Faust myth with Goethe inheriting this myth. And Goethe he was curious about everything. As we know, the dude was a genius. And so he doesn't condemn Faust. In the end of Faust Part 2, he sends Faust up into heaven, and he plugs Faust into the iconotype of the ascent of the Virgin Mary. So he ascends up into heaven along with Margarita. They ascend into heaven, and they are awarded Faust is awarded specifically for his quest, for having the courage to go on the quest and learn everything about everything. So I think here that what inevitably happens is that what Guenon is saying is the popularization of the esoteric as a trend of modernity isn't really a trend of modernity. It's the essence of Faustian civilization. It has been its telos all along to trend into forbidden areas, to go into areas that other societies have simply said, well, you don't fuck with that. Genomics, should we clone? Of course we should clone. Why not? Why shouldn't we? So we've got Dolly, the sheep, and pretty soon we'll be cloning humans. That's the Faustian experiment. Bring all of the entities out of the dark regions of being, unconceal them in the clearing, and let's see what they've got. And it goes all the way down through this New Age popularization that Guenon says is characteristic of modernity, but which is really the ultimate telos and outcome of the West, which I think in hypermodernity more than anything else, the internet is the sort of telos for bringing all knowledge out and making it available to the public. You can find out about anything you want all there. This has been the goal of the West all along. So this is the difference between the closed and the open universes. And Guenon wants to go back into the closed universe, seal knowledge off inside of a dome, and wrap it up. So that's what's really going on in that chapter, I think. And then with rationalism, he's got a chapter against rationalism. And here I think he's on firmer ground that rationalism, a tendency toward the worship of reason, does tend to become a characteristic of decadent, late phase societies. This is basically the same point of view that Nietzsche had in The Birth of Tragedy when he wrote about the problem with Socrates, was that he introduced the influence of rationalism via Euripides, his friend, into the Greek tragic cycle, and as a result destroyed it. Reason can indeed be a destructive thing, and I think that the French really exemplify that. The French Cartesian tradition, the French bring the Socratic man into northern, Western, Faustian civilization, just as the Greeks had Socrates. So the French bring in reason with Descartes and the tradition of rationalism. You get with Descartes the introduction of reason. Then it becomes something that becomes deconstructive during the French Revolution. They want to tear everything down, tear away all the old narratives. Then with the Impressionists and painting, the Impressionists come along and deconstruct perspectival space. They pull it apart. So we have a new thing there with a perspectival space. And then we finally get actual philosophical deconstruction with Derrida from the French in the 60s. So the French have really exemplified the rational aspect of Western civilization, the Socratic man, and it is a destructive thing. Too much rationality in a society is not necessarily a good thing. It can destroy all the old traditions. And so this is really the challenge that the West took up in becoming the civilization that wants to know everything, but yet in order to do that, you do have to use the intellect, you do have to use reason, and so reason becomes worshipped as this almighty tool for uncovering and bringing out all the secrets, but at the same time it's also destructive, or at least potentially destructive, because you can sterilize and rationalize beliefs out of the way. The soul's emotional connection to the supra-rational, not irrational, but the supra-rational realm of the transcendent spirit, that connection gets lost in late phase, megalopolitan, decadent societies of the type here that I think Guenon is more or less correctly diagnosing. So he's in this sort of same, he's kind of an irritable guy, you can tell from the narrative, as was Spengler, as are all these guys who did not have, turned a cold shoulder to the modernization process and to modernity. All of them are a bit irritable, and I think that comes through in Guénon's chapters here. So that's that section.